Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Don. Thank you to the Extension School for the invitation, the opportunity to come here this afternoon and commit some historian's fallacies over the next 14 minutes, 45 seconds. Don was kind enough to mention a book that I co-authored with my father about 7 years ago. This was a major mistake, if not a fallacy. If any of you is ever considering co-authoring a book with a close relative, come talk to me afterward. Save you some heartache. I am going to speak about environmental history, and I'm going to begin with a little bit of orientation, because some of you, like me, went to school when there was no such thing as environmental history and may not know much about it. My preferred definition of it is the history of the relationship between humankind and the rest of the biosphere on which humankind depends. Other people would define it somewhat differently. I also sometimes claim that environmental history is history written as if nature existed. The implicit criticism being that the rest of historians give the natural world, the ecological context, the full context of human affairs, short shrift, which is in most cases true, by no means in all cases true. One of the distinctions of environmental history is that normally, not always, it seeks to, I'm going to use some historical jargon here, give agency to the non-human actors in history, so that, according to environmental historians, mules and mosquitoes and rivers can be historical actors, just as human beings and institutions and governments might be. 30, 40 years ago, with the rise of social history in professional history circles, historians sought to, this is somewhat solipsistic of us, to give voice to groups that had been written out of history. Slaves, for instance, in the American context, women, marginalized groups, sometimes known as the subalterns of history. Well, mosquitoes and mules are the subalterns of history. But environmental history attempts to give them their due. In this country, environmental history as a self-conscious enterprise arose only in the 1970s. It gathered its fuel from the environmental movement abroad in society as a whole. Since that time, it has grown exponentially. It's very popular amongst the rising generations of historians. In this country, there are about 1,000 people who describe themselves as environmental historians. I would say that there are three main types of environmental history and environmental historians. The first I like to call material environmental history, and that's about frogs in forests, or mules and mosquitoes, or chlorofluorocarbons. Then there's political, policy, and legal environmental history, and that's about how people have sought to regulate their relationship with the natural world, and how people and groups of people have fought over how nature ought to be handled, treated, regarded. So, to some extent, that is an outgrowth of political history and legal history. And then thirdly, there is a cultural and intellectual brand of environmental history, which concerns itself with what people in the past have thought and written, and very occasionally sung or danced, about the relationship between humankind and the natural world. And so that is usually a variety of intellectual and cultural history, as well as a variety of environmental history. That's my preliminary orientation. Now, a few words about the writing of environmental history and some of the particular challenges therein. My first point is that it's not substantially different from other kinds of history in the mechanics of writing. One still makes the same kinds of decisions every other historian makes about narrative versus analytical approach, or how to blend them, when to zoom in on details and when to zoom out for context. All this is more or less as usual for historians. Some of the contexts and some of the interpolations that environmental historians offer are different, of course. We might pause in our narrative to explain how chlorofluorocarbons affect the ozone molecules of the stratosphere, which other historians rarely pause to do, but they pause and explain other kinds of contextual matters. It's just they have to focus on other things than chlorofluorocarbons. I feel sorry for them. So, in the basics, in the mechanics, I think it's thoroughly conventional in the way that environmental historians go about their trade. But there are some challenges that are not all that routine among historians. I'm going to mention 4 of them. Some of them are shared with other fields or sub-disciplines within history. Some of them are not. The first one is how engaged, committed, activist, or political an author might wish to be. This is an issue for most kinds of environmental history. It's not an issue, I would imagine, for Nancy writing about legal matters in Muscovy. I could be wrong, but for environmental historians, they always have to think, almost always, am I doing this in order to make a political point, offer some kind of commentary on the situation today? Do I want to be partisan? And there's some fabulous historians who say to themselves, yes, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to be engaged and committed. I want to make my work resonate and serve a larger purpose. Then there's some others for whom that's not an attractive option. I have chosen so far to be as calm and detached as I can be. Partly that's a reflection of my phlegmatic personality. But the older I get, the more tempted I am to cut loose. So we shall see. This is a decision, a challenge that is shared by some other kinds of history. Labor history, for example, people who work in that pasture often are motivated by their sympathies, their political orientation, and there's some other subfields, subdisciplines of history for which that is true as well. It's almost always true for environmental historians, and there's no consensus about how best to proceed. Second challenge, what environmental historians call declensionism, which is a grand way of saying things always seem to get worse and worse. And a lot of environmental history is written this way, and it irritates some readers because it means that the stories are predictable and they're depressing. Personally, I don't regard this as anywhere near an insurmountable challenge, because there are other kinds of history that are certainly much more depressing. There's history of war and genocide, for example. History of Russia and the Soviet Union. Sorry, Nancy, I mean none of this personally. But many environmental historians do, and partly this arises sometimes from the political commitments that they have, writing about things getting worse all the time, which does make things, as I said, a bit predictable. I think that's easily avoided, although nonetheless the challenge I feel is often not met by my colleagues. Easily avoided because there are lots of happy stories in environmental history too. You just have to look for them and tell them. Third challenge, a very awkward fit with the nation state. A lot of historians nowadays are trying to step outside the traditional framework of the nation state, which after all is a relic of 19th century German approaches to history. And environmental historians, more than many, do this because they have to, because the mosquitoes and the mules don't even know about the political boundaries on the maps, because some of the cultural intellectual trends are thoroughly transnational. The ecology movement in the 1960s and 1970s coalesced all over the world, with a few exceptions, at almost the same time. It was as international or transnational as an intellectual, cultural, and political movement can be. So environmental history sits especially poorly with the traditional focus on the nation-state that historians have often, but increasingly rarely, committed themselves to. The one kind of environmental history that does go well with the nation-state is the political, policy, administrative, legal, and regulatory type, because that is intimately associated with the state. My fourth and final challenge is one that I think all historians face, but I'll explore it a little bit as regards environmental history. And that is to find the right scale between macro and micro inquiry. As Sue reminded me this afternoon, one of the things we were invited to reflect upon was how historians operate in the current publishing environment, where editors and publishers want fewer and fewer small-scale monographic works and more books about how somebody saved the world. My contention in this is that historians in general, and environmental historians in particular, need collectively to operate on all scales. That doesn't mean each individual needs to operate on all scales. But the micro and macro approaches need to be pursued consciously in dialogue with one another. So it might be interesting to write a history of the air quality of Glasgow between 1860 and 1863, might be, if one did so in dialogue with larger contexts about industrialization in the 19th century, about struggles against pollution within industrializing societies. But if one doesn't do that, one has veered into antiquarianism and triviality, and one shouldn't expect to be read. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, macro-scale history, which I have a certain partiality towards, needs to be pursued in careful dialogue with as much micro-scale history as one has time to ingest, because otherwise it becomes detached, unreliable, unsound, unmoored, full of blanket generalizations without proper grounding in the warp and weft of actual human experience. So a history of the atmosphere in general over the last, let us say, 250,000 years, that's roughly the lifespan of the human species, if it were not anchored in things as arcane as the air quality history of Glasgow and 1,000 other similarly arcane things, would be, as I say, unmoored. So the challenge then is the right balance between the specific and the general, the micro and the macro. It's one, unlike some of the other challenges that I referred to, that all historians face. Thank you.